So, Shalom Aleichem to all of you and Bruchim Aboim. I understand that many of you came from Chutz La'aretz, as most of the people here from Chutz La'aretz. So the place to come together, Az Nidberu Yirei Hashem Ishel Re'eu V'Yakshav Hashem V'Yishma, the place to come together is in Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh. This is the center. This is the center of Yiddishkeit, the center of Torah, the center of Kashrus, the center of everything that is precious to us all. So, Bruchim Haboim B'Shem Hashem. I do not know much about ECHO, and I asked Rav Kravkovsky, my dear friend, to tell me what is this organization. And he said, it's somewhat like the UN of the Kashrus world. It didn't give me much more clarity, but I understand that this is an umbrella organization which encourages cooperation between various different Kashrus organizations, and I think that is of extreme importance. Kashrus is precious to every Jew that is a Yerei Shamayim. And Macholas Asuros, in a way, are the most serious or harshest Avedas Shebetoiro. Toises, a few different sources in Shas explain that the concept Behemton shel tzadikim eina kodesh boch hu mevi takola al yodam tzadikim atzman loy kol shekein does not apply only to macholas asuros. The Or Zerua brings an opinion ein halacha kemoisoi, but there is a shitta brought in the Or Zerua that even though pikuach nefesh derech kol asurim shebetoiro, and it is a avera to be machmir shar isurim besides gimel avedas chamuros b'mokim pekuach nefesh. But regarding macholas asuros, a person has the entitlement, the right to put his life in jeopardy and not eat macholas asuros. So we all appreciate how kashrus is important to us all. And having major Kashrus organizations cooperate is an extremely important endeavor. Originally, I was asked to speak about Yored Le'umnes Chaveroi in the area of Kashrus, and I declined. I don't like to step on landmines, and I don't know enough. I don't know enough about the subject matter. I don't know enough about the sveikas, the dilemmas. So I said, please give me some other topics to talk about. Not that this topic isn't important, but I felt that I don't know enough about the dilemmas, about the challenges, but sitting around the same table, and this is a huge table, and having Kashrus organizations cooperate is an extremely important endeavor, and whatever I could do to help, I will always be part of it. So I was asked to speak about two different topics, and one topic which Rabbi Genak and Rabbi Kravkovsky asked me to talk about is Mesorah in Halacha, especially focusing on the dilemma of Chelek Achorayim of behemoths that are minhag Ashkenaz to stay away of. And so once again, I am not familiar enough. I think the OU does not give a hechsher, is that correct? So this is a very interesting topic. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the dilemma about the hind side, the hind part of behemoths is a fascinating one. And one of the earliest sources is the Be'er Heitiv in Sif Choten Zayin Siman Samach Daled. And the lashon of the Be'er Heitiv is, and it's in parentheses, Yesh Shittois Lahachmir. Sosam Veloy Perish. Who are those Shittois Lahachmir? Who are the opinions that say, he seems to be saying that there are opinions that say you are not allowed to eat the back part of a behemoth, and we are not aware of who are those shittas. Yeshua's Yankov, was one of the greatest poskim of his generation, almost 200 years ago in Lemberg. The Yeshua Yankov Masif Beis, in that very same Siman Yoredei Samech Dalad writes that the Marshal writes that Yireh Hashem should stay away from the Chelek Achoiri of Behemoth, which is not really exact, because the Yam Shlomo deals with this question twice in Yam Shlomo Masechet Chulin, first Perek Siman Beis. How does it come into the first Perek, which deals with Shchita, and it doesn't deal with the Isser of Chelev? But in Siman Beis, in the very first Perek, in the beginning of Masechet Chulin, Yam Shlomo discusses Ne'emonis of women. When do we trust the Ne'emonis, the testimony of women? And from Shchita, he gets to Chelev, to Nikor. And what the Yam Shlomo does write, that the Maharam Mintz, this goes back hundreds of years, the Maharam Mintz made a takana that Nikor should be supervised by two people, the Menaka and another Mumcha. And he pleads with the Menakim, don't be embarrassed, don't be hurt if we have another person check whether you did your job properly because of the complications of Nikor. So in both sources, Chelek Zayin Siman Yutes, Chelek Perek Zayin Siman Yutes, Perek Aleph Siman Beis, the Yam Shlomo recommends we have two people going over Nikor, and after the Menaka does his work, another one should check whether it was done properly. The Yeshua Yankov does write, I was asked from the Kehillah in Broad about Nikor on calves, on young animals, and I said the minhag is not to do Nikor, and if you're dealing with calves and not with grown cows, then you should not rely on Nikor. He doesn't write who the Shoyel was, who was the Gadol or the Rav that turned to him, but Reb Shlomo Kluger, in his Chuvas, Elef Lachosh Shlomo Yoredei Siman Kuf Chof, says, I was the one that turned to the Yeshua Yankov, and I was adamant about not doing Nikor on young animals. So Reb Shlomo Kluger and the Yeshua Yankov said we should not rely on Nikor when we're dealing with young animals. And the Kaf HaChaim, even though he was one of the great Sephardi Gedolim, adopts that minhag in his Kehillas as well. So 200 years ago, in the days of the Yeshua Yankov, Ashkenazi Kehillas did rely on Nikor, and it is obvious from the Yeshua Yankov because he writes, we should not rely on Nikor by young calves, and however, he quotes the Marshal mistakenly, quoting the Marshal that Yirei Shamayim do not rely on Nikor, and it's not exactly what the Marshal says. Noida B'Yuda, Tinyona, Siman Lamed Aleph, Chasam Soifa, Siman Samaches, both deal with Nikor, how to do Nikor, which parts are permissible. It is obvious, and these Gedolim were more or less the same time, the same generation, the Noida B'Yuda, the Yeshua Yankov, the Chasam Soifa, and it is obvious in their Chuvas that even Ashkenazi Kehillas did rely on Nikor. Orcha Shulchan, Sifnam Nun Daled in Siman Samach Daled writes, Rava Mekoimis, in our Kehillas, Rava Mekoimis do not eat the back part of an animal. So the Orcha Shulchan was a later generation, and we see that the minhag to stay away from Chelek Acharayim became more accepted in later generations, as we see in the Orach HaShulchan. Achiezer, there's somewhat a confusing tshuva. The very last tshuva in Chelek Gimel Tshuvas Achiezer, Siman Pei Daled, and it is not clear what the background to this tshuva is, but the Achiezer writes, B'shas at Chag Godel, because the entire endeavor of kosher shchita is in jeopardy, mitzad the government, and he says he would rely if we have proper menaklim. What is the background to this tshuva? We see in Shalas Tshuvas Mekadshe Hashem. I'm not sure everybody is familiar with the Mekadshe Hashem, so I need to give some introductory remarks. This sefer is very precious to me, and it is a very, very unique sefer. Reb Hershel Meislish and I knew him. I had the privilege to know him, and we spent time together. Rabbi Shalom Eislich was a dayan in Weizen in Hungary, and he was in Auschwitz, and one of the most important, fascinating, and troubling documents of the Mesiras Nefesh of frum people during that terrible period of our history. One of the most important documents is the introduction to the Shalosh Teshuvos Mekadshe Hashem. I also have some personal stories to share which I heard from him, but I don't think this is the right forum right now. I don't want to take your time. So Mekadshe Hashem is a compilation of tshuvas and letters of Gedol Yisrael, most of them young Gedol Yisrael that perished during the Holocaust. And they didn't leave any sforim, and Rabbi Shalom Eislich brought those tshuvas together. And that is why the name of the Sefer is Shalosh Teshuvos Mekadshe Hashem. Of the material in that Sefer was written by Gedolim Hashem Yinkem Damam that were killed by the Nazis during the Holocaust. Chelek Aleph Simach Chav Gimel, Chav Dalet, Chav Hey, there is a correspondence, a fascinating correspondence, which is the background to the tshuva printed in Achiezer. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, and Rebbe Tzion, the Baba Verov, who perished during the war, the Kedushas Tzion, and they discussed, is it time to be lenient and enable Ashkenazim and our Kehilas to eat Acharayim? Why? If the minhag was not to, what was the incentive, the motivation to be matir? It was, I think, Tov Reish Tzadik Ches, a year or two before the Holocaust broke out, and the governments in Eastern Europe, one after the other, came against Jewish Shlit. And for some reason, some Askonim or Gedolim thought that if we will be lenient and enable our people to eat the back side of an animal, then we will be more successful in convincing the governments to be lenient and let us go about with our procedures and our shchita. So the Baba Verov turned to Reb Chaim Oizar, encouraging the Lubavitcher Rebbe and the tshuva, which is printed in Achiezer, and he doesn't write to whom this tshuva went. It actually was written to the Kedushas Tzion, to the Baba Verov, and they all agreed under the circumstances to be matir nikur even in Lithuanian and Ashkenazi Kehilas. Not everybody agreed to that psak, and Abaran Volkan from Pinsk, from Lithuania, in his tshuvas, Zekan Aharon Simalamed Zayin, does not agree to this psak, and he says there is no room for leniency. Before these Gedolim, who were pre-Holocaust, the Zekan Aharon also perished during the war. Years before, we find the tshuva in Yad HaLevi, and Rabbi Yitzchak Dov Bamberger, who was the Rav in Würzburg, one of the great Gedolim in Germany, comes out very strongly against Nikur. And the Lamdisha part of this discussion takes us to Hilchas Nedorim and away from DNA Nikur and Isur Chelev to Hilchas Nedorim. So a minhag, the minhag that was accepted, is there room for Hatoras Nedorim? Is there room for leniency? Nidre Mitzvah, we are not matir. There is no shaila by Nidre Mitzvah. However, when we're dealing with a minhag, but the minhag was lachazik chaymois hadas, is there room to be lenient in Hatoras Nedorim? And part of this discussion was, how did this minhag come to be in the first place? Was it just out of a matter of convenience? It was hard to find proper menaklim or to teach them. And because there was no problem in selling part of every animal to the goyim, though it was just out of a matter of convenience, or was it really lachazik eis yesoides hadas? Was it because the Gedolim were afraid that the nikkur isn't proper, isn't good enough, and we are machshel sarabim, or was it just out of a matter of convenience? If it is a matter of convenience, then there definitely is room for a Toras Nedorim, because it would not be defined as a mitzvah or a minhag shel mitzvah. So it is very hard to go back in history and to understand what brought about a minhag. And this is actually the point of discussion. So our generation is familiar with the famous Shuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein, in Igis Moshe, Chelik Beis Yoredeis Mem Beis, and Rav Moshe sees no problem in reinstituting Nikor. And he writes the reason that in previous generations they stayed away from Nikor is just because it wasn't financially viable. We had no problem giving part of the animal and selling into the goyim, and it's just a matter of convenience, and therefore we definitely could be a matir nikor bizman hazeh. We just need to give good courses and to prepare and to teach and to instruct menakrim. So the Moshe is quite lenient about the question of nikor. Yad Halevi, Rav Bamberger, strongly argues, my feeling is, and my knowledge is, that the reason Ashkenazi Gedolim stayed away from Nikor is because of the difficulty to be Menaker, and it definitely was Lemigdar Milta. Lemigdar Milta Ulachazek es Choymes Adas, and therefore there is no room for leniency. I think the most important source is the Chasam Sofer, because he is the first one dealing with this, not with the Nikor dilemma, but rather with the question, why? Those Kehillas that did not do Nikor, and it's obvious in the Tshuva of the Chasam Sofer that they did do Nikor in his time, but those did not, the Chasam Sofer, Tshuva I mentioned before, Yoredei Samaches, he writes, Mepnei HaTircha, because of the Torah. So, if we accept the testimony of the Chasam Sofer, there would be more room for leniency. So before the Holocaust, there was argumentation and disagreement between the Gedolim. Is there room for leniency? And the Achiezer writes, there is, and together with the Lubavitcher Rebbe and the Bobbe Verav, and the Zekanahan Rabban Volkan was very unhappy about this, and he says, Lishitosai, there is no room for leniency. And we find the same in Shalosh Teshuvos, Afar Kasta Da'ani. I don't know whether you're familiar with these names. Afar Kasta Da'ani was Abdovich Sperber, one of the Gedolim in Romania. So this question spans countries, and from Lithuania to Poland to Hungary to Romania, and primarily in Ashkenazi Kehelis. The very first source that comes out strongly against Nikor is Dari HaKodesh Al Pi Kabbalah. And that is in Tam Mitzvah of Chaim Vital in Parshas Vayikra. He writes that Dari HaKodesh was against using the hind part of animals and do not rely on Nikor, and that is totally Al Pi Kabbalah. The Bnei Yissaschar, in his Sefer Derech Pikudecho and Mitzvah Beis, and the Bnei Yissaschar was one of the greatest Gedolim of his time, and he was a Ish Eshkoilos, and his Svarim are in Lamdis and Psak Halacha and Chasidus and Kabbalah, and one of his Svarim is Derech Pikudecho, and Derech Pikudecho is on Taiga Mitzvah Shebetoira. I do not recall, but I think we only have about 50 mitzvahs, and we do not know, did he finish his Sefer on Taryag mitzvahs, or that is all he did, or maybe he did the entire set of Taryag mitzvahs, but he didn't, we don't have anymore. And a mitzvah base, and this amazing Sefer, the spirit of the Sefer is to explain in each and every one of the mitzvahs, Chelek, Dibur, Machshava, and Maaser. And he quotes that the Ruach HaKodesh turned to the Beis Yosef and asked the Beis Yosef to come out against Nikor and to totally abolish Nikor. We don't know that, but that is what the Bnei Yissaschar writes. So the very first source is the Ruach HaKodesh. The Shlo HaKodesh writes that he has a tzavor from his father not to rely on Nikor, and the Shlo and Shara Oisius passes on that tzavor to his coming generations. So these are the very early sources coming out against Nicker, and obviously it was based on Kabbalah. The Riyah Kodesh, the Shlom, quoting his father, and Rabbi Eliezer Ashkenazi was a Talmud of the Bach, and in his Sefer the Mesek Eliezer, he also comes out strongly against Nicker. An interesting letter that I saw in a periodical that was printed, I think, by the European Vidat Rabbanei Europa, which is called Shvilim. I don't remember when I saw that, but there's a correspondence between the Rav of Glasgow in Scotland, who was Rabbi Yomen Benish Atlas, and in Tov Shin Aleph, he turned to Reb Cheskel Avramsky, who was the Rosh based in London, and he asked, could I support, could I enable Nicker in Glasgow, in my city? And Reb Cheskel Avramsky writes that all the Kehilas in England stay away from Nicker besides London. I don't know why besides London, and I don't know which based in London did do Nicker. So I don't know the historical background, but the Rav of Glasgow turns to Reb Cheskel Avramsky and he wants to enable Nicker. And Reb Cheskel Avramsky is strongly against it, and he says, Ein l'shanois minhag Yisrael, and we stay away from Nicker. And so this minhag, to stay away from Nicker and totally not touch the half of an animal, half of the cows, is a minhag that with time gathered more acceptance, as we see 200 years ago, the greatest gedolim of that era, the Noida B'Yehuda, the Yeshua Zank of the Chassam Sefer, did not totally come out against Nicker. So when I am asked, I say our generation should not be the generation. We have so much to struggle with and so much to deal with. Minhag, you say, no, biyadenu. So there seems to be confusion and disagreement between the Gedolim. What is the origin of the minhag not to rely on Nicker? Was it more a matter of convenience or really ekpeda lemigdar mirta? Psochim daf nun, and that is one of the two sources in Shas in which Chazal explain why are minhagim important. Twice in Shas, Chazal ask, Minolon, that minhagim have relevance, that minhagim are binding, and that's Psochim Daf Nun and Chulin Daf Tzaddik Gimel. And in both these sources, Chazal quote the same posuk in Mishlei, Shema b'ri musar avicho v'al titosh teres emecho. And to the best of my recollection, Chazal only quote the second half of the posuk, Al titosh teres emecho. So obviously, even though teres emecho would seem to be dealing with Torah, and Musar would be dealing with minhag. But Chazal's interpretation is different. Musar ovicho is Halacha. Because the fathers, men who are those that are mitzvah, have the obligation and the privilege to teach Torah. So Shema b'ri musar ovicho would be Halacha, al titosh teres emecho would be minhag. So Chulin Tzaddik Gimel, the Gemara deals with a minhag regarding Evim and Achai, Macholas Asuros. Shab im Psochim Daf Nun, thank you. Im Psochim Daf Nun, the sugya is Hilchas Shabbos and not Macholas Asuros. And the Gemara says in Psochim Daf Nun, Bnei Baishan came before Rabbi Yochanan and they said, Avo Yisenu had a minhag that did not travel from Tzor to Tzidon on Erev Shabbos. Tzor and Tzidon are two cities in northern Israel, today in Lebanon. And there are about 10 kilometers between these two cities, and they used to travel by boat because the most convenient way to travel in days of yore, in the days of Chazal, was using waterways. And Bnei Baishan came before Rabbi Yochanan and they said, our overs took upon themselves, they had a minhag to abstain from traveling from Torah to Tzidon on Fridays. Fridays was the market day, and that's when people did most of their business. And so Bnei Baishan told Rabbi Yochanan, Our forefathers could afford it, but we can't afford it. Times are different. We're struggling financially. Do we still need to adhere to this minhag? And Rabbi Yochanan quoted the posuk, Al titashter semechu, hizharu b'minhag aviseichem b'yodeichem. So some gedolim quote this Gemara to prove, even though their minhag was not based on Yiddishkeit, it wasn't based on chumras, it was just, they could afford it. V'yafal pikem, the Gemara says that the minhag is binding, so the same goes to the minhag of nikah. Even though it was a matter of convenience or financial viability, the minhag is still binding. And I think that's a mistake. It is clear in the Gemara that the minhag of Avoseim Shel B'nai Baishan was a chumra in Hilchos Shabbos. The chashash was, maybe we won't get home on time on Shabbos. Their descendants argued, our forefathers could afford it. We can't afford it. It doesn't mean that their forefathers abstained out of convenience. Of course it was a chumra in Hilchos Shabbos. But their children argued, we could no longer afford this chumra, so could we be lenient? And Rabbi Yochanan said, no, this minhag is binding. But if the incentive and the origin to stay away from nikah was financial or just the fact that it was hard to produce menakrim, then that definitely would not be fined as a minhag shel mitzvah. But as I mentioned before, between the gedolim this was confusion and a question. So if any Kashrus organization would ask me, would it be kedai to reinstitute nikah for Kahali, for Ashkenazi keles, I definitely would say no. The Moshe Sternbuch has 2 tshuvas about this, and Chelak Aleph tshuvas van Hoges. I think these tshuvas were written while Hagon Reb Moshe was Rav in Johannesburg, and he also strongly is against reinstituting nikah in Ashkenazi keles. So this is the first topic I was asked to discuss. And the other topic I was asked to discuss is mirtas based on AI. And I really don't exactly know how AI would be instrumental and helpful in mirtas. The concept of mirtas is found in Issa V'Heter only in Cholevakum. In other areas of Macholas Asurais, there is also some discussion, but the concept of mirtas is in Cholevakum Yoredesem Akuf Tezvav. So when there is a mashgiach, even though he cannot see all the stations, the milking stations, because he is seated, but if he gets up and stands, he could see, that is enough to do mirtas. So the Gemara deals with a mashgiach that is sitting, but if he stands, he can see exactly what's going on. The pois can broaden this heter, hu adin beyoytze v'nechnas. So Cholevakim is a huge discussion I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with. And the Psak of Reb Moshe, once again, Reb Moshe was lenient regarding Stam Cholov. So Eges Moshe Yerdei Chelak Aleph Simon Mem Zayin, the Moshe says we could rely on mirtas, which is based on the violation of the law. Everybody quotes Reb Moshe, but it actually is a Chazon Ish, and the Chazon Ish is the predecessor of Reb Moshe. I would not get into a lengthy discussion right here and now about Cholevakum because this is not the topic probably we deal with, but the concept of mirtas. Minchas Osher, Shalosh Tshuvas Chelek Dalet Siman Ayin Gimel. Don't try to find it because it's still, to my dismay, is a Dover Shaloi Buli Olam. It's a Vida de Ossi, but it's not printed yet. It is ready for print, and I really hope in the very near future we will have. But there's a lengthy siman in Minchas Osher Chelek Dalet Siman Ayin Gimel, and to me, to say mirtas because of violating the law, liakoton, who am I to question the Chazon Ish and Reb Moshe, but it would be an extreme kula to assume that people are afraid to violate the law. Why do we have tens of thousands of people sitting in jails for white-collar crimes if violating the law is such a huge mirtas? What we find in Chazal, mirtas, has nothing to do with umen lomara nosei. It has to do with the inconvenience, the embarrassment of a person being caught red-handed doing something that he's not allowed to do. And therefore, umen lomara nosei is a totally different concept. Mirtas is people are extremely embarrassed to be caught on the spot red-handed doing something that they promised not to do or they are not allowed to do. So, assuming that there is mirta, some people will be afraid because mixing non-kosher milk into kosher milk is a violation of the law. To me, that would be a huge chiddush. However, in the tshuva I mentioned that I hope you will all be able to learn in the very near future, I dealt with surveillance cameras, and I said that that is the ultimate mirzas. That is the ultimate mirzas. Far more and far better than having a mashgiach on the spot. And not only a mashgiach that will come once in a while, yoytze v'nechnes, surveillance cameras would be more effective than having 3 mashgiachim on the premises. How do I know? Ask any supermarket chain, any of them, how many Genevis there were when there were 10 supervisors on the floor and surveillance cameras brought the Genevis down by 99%. So I think surveillance cameras actually are eyes. They are eyes. You actually see. But you see far more than any mashgiach could see. And therefore, in my opinion, if you have a good system, you could rely on that mirtas. I'm just trying to guess how AI comes into the picture because Rabbi Kurkovsky that asked me to speak about this wasn't more knowledgeable than I am. Exactly, well, how do we want to utilize AI? I could only guess or assume. AI analyzes data. It's not only seeing, probably fundamentally is based on a camera system, but the added value is just the analysis, and AI will be able to analyze when a person approaches a point in the kitchen or in the factory where he is not supposed to be and analyzes what he did, maybe even facial expressions. I have no idea. But could we use AI to achieve mirtas? So my non-knowledgeable opinion would be, if it is based on a system of photography, it is based on a system of cameras, but it is just an added level of analysis to understand whether there is a chashash, then I definitely would support it. But if it comes instead of actually filming or seeing, I think that would just be a level of umdana. And to the little I know about artificial intelligence, in my age, you usually have difficulty getting into new technologies. So people tell me stories all the time about ChatGPT, how smart and wise he is. And a person just showed me, he asked ChatGPT, what do you say about Weiss? And I think his response was extremely complimentary and nice. I agree to every word he said. And then he asked, do you think Weiss is the Gadol Hador? And his answer was so intelligent. He said, I'm not human and I have no opinions. Whether a person is the Gadol Hador is an opinion. Don't ask me for opinions because I have none. You could ask me for facts, for analysis. I can't answer this question. He did disappoint me. But, so I think we could utilize AI to enhance, but it must be based on a system in which we see things, because otherwise it would be a umdana. And in many areas, AI is very questionable. It's not an absolute science, it is questionable. Not always is it accurate. It's always interesting, but not always accurate. So I don't know exactly how Kashrus organizations could take advantage of artificial intelligence. If it is a gather of umdana, I would say you cannot be machadish a new concept of mirtas. Mirtas must be based on the way Chazal described it. Okay, so this is about what I had to say, what I prepared to say, and now I was asked to relinquish this mic. Okay, so we're going to have some questions.
With Nassim Dubin, with regards to AI, I'm not sure specifically what the topic was, but I think with AI, generally speaking, it would work within a camera surveillance system. So I have two questions. In general, in a camera surveillance system, so we've used them in our establishments for years. We have found things that there would be absolutely no other way to find that happened over the years. Incredible stuff that we found with surveillance cameras. The challenge with surveillance cameras, what we find is that if you don't have somebody watching them and you're not alerted to it, then you may never know that something happened, because it's just such a voluminous amount of information that it's collecting. So like in one case that we had many years ago, there was a worker that alerted us that there might be something going on after hours at a certain time or whatever it was. We checked the cameras and there was, and we were able to remove the hashgacha. But if we wouldn't have been alerted to it by the mashgiach, who understood Spanish and heard the workers talking and so on, we would never have known about that. So that was just my first, just a general question. Is there a difference when the Rav is saying surveillance cameras, whether they're actively being monitored versus just they're being potentially could be checked at a later date?
We're dealing with the concept of mirtas. So even if you did not monitor, you still could rely on mirtas if all the workers on the premises are aware that there is a system. However, there are no secrets in modern society. And if you don't monitor the cameras, sooner or later, the people on the floor will know that you don't monitor the cameras, and therefore you will lose the entire concept. So I think it should be monitored. It does not necessarily need to be in real time, but they should be monitored. If they won't be monitored, then the workers will know sooner or later that they're not being monitored, and then it means nothing. So yes, you should monitor the system on a steady basis. But even if it happened and it wasn't monitored, the concept is mirtas. The concept is not knowing, but the concept is just preventing potential wrongdoing, and it is about people being afraid to be caught. And therefore, you should definitely need to monitor the system, but if there are a day or two it wasn't monitored, or there was a technical glitch and the cameras for some time didn't work, that doesn't answer the milk, because it's more about the concept of mirtas.
And one more point, just with regards to AI. I think that the capacity of AI generally would be paired together with surveillance cameras. So you can train the AI system to notice patterns, which means that if somebody other than the mashgiach opens up the store, it'll recognize the face and it'll alert you. So my understanding is, generally speaking, when someone's asking about AI with regards to Kashrus, generally speaking, what that means is AI together with surveillance and basically would take the surveillance just up another notch.
It is what I imagined, as I said, without knowing, and in that case, it only enhances the system, and it definitely should be encouraged.
If I could just ask the Rav to clarify. The Rav said earlier that a camera system is better than 3 mashgichim. But the psychology of a person is that when there's someone in front of them and they're walking around and it's a chai, the person's alive, that's mirsas. We have found workers tend to forget that there's a camera up there. There's a step removed, and they push it. The mirsas leaves. That's what we have found. Is that not part of the cheshbon?
Once again, I trust people that are directly involved in kashrus, and I will not dispute their opinions. But I think, as I mentioned, it is well known and statistically verified in department stores and supermarkets around the world. And it must be obvious to everybody working in the plant that there are surveillance cameras. There should be a big notice, a sign, and the cameras should be positioned, they should be obvious to workers. And as if a mashgiach is, foolproof, and we know many problems with mashgiachim, because usually a mashgiach isn't there constantly, and a mashgiach comes in and out. Those organizations that want to keep on working with mashgiachim, well, that's what they did for 2,000 years, so I definitely won't object. But factually, I think surveillance cameras are as good as mashgiachim, and maybe even more effective. But it needs to be obvious that the premises is filmed.
Yosefan, KCL Lakewood. I just want to be clear. The Rav is saying this by Mirsis and also by Chalav Yisrael and Gvinas Yisrael, those who hold Re'iyah, is a factor that the Mashgiach will watch it the next day and that will cover Yisrael Re'ehu?
I think so, but I do not think it is wise to let workers know when they are monitored. And I think we should be fluid. Sometimes real time, but it needs to be monitored in a serious way.
Chaim Fogelman from the OK. We have worked with cameras for quite a while, and we have found that the cameras are not reliable in the fact that they go off very often, and the owners of the companies can turn them off if they want to, and that circumvents and goes around what we're trying to do. So we use cameras only as a second support if there's actually mashgichim there, because it's very easy to turn off a camera, or a camera goes off because the internet went off and there's no way to monitor it. So then it's something that's just there, but it's really not there.
Any chumrah that an organization will adopt, which means adding surveillance cameras to mashgichim on the premises, Tovei Bruch Al Rosh, I definitely will support that. And I do not recommend using cameras instead of mashgichim. But the fact that, no, this needs to be clear, that the only people that could turn the cameras off are the mashgichim, are the Kashrus organization. If the owner could turn them off, then that is not hashgocha at all. It is as if the owner could send the mashgiach out of the room. And if the owner of the company could turn off the camera, and I thank you for bringing up this point, because it should be very obvious.
We found that it's almost impossible that there's no access or somehow to shut off the camera, even from a side way.
And if the cameras are failing, we need a system in which the workers will have no idea whether the cameras are working or not. That is one prerequisite, that is one condition. And the other is, if the owner could turn off the cameras whenever he wishes, then once again that would be void. Unless there is a system which limits the owner, and he needs to know if the cameras are turned off, then he will lose the hashgacha. So I'm not going into technicalities. Theoretically, cameras see better than the human eye, but the technicalities need to be worked out, definitely. So I thank you for that comment.
I would just add to Rabbi Fogelman's point. What we found is that no matter how well you secured it, we had in one place where we installed security cameras, we put the DVR, which is doing the live recording, we put it into a locked box in a high area, but it's impossible because all they need to do is change the Wi-Fi password or find one plug and pull it out, or by mistake, from our experience, it's virtually impossible to prevent them from shutting off the cameras. In actuality.
Okay, listen. You have the experience, I have zero experience, and my psukim are based on AI, on data that I am provided to. So obviously, our conclusion should be we should have mashgichim on the spot and enhance the supervision by having a system of surveillance cameras as well.
Yehuda Goldman, Earth Kosher. Tesla, the company behind the electric cars that are today very common, is developing what's called Tesla Optimus, which is a human-like robot powered by AI that is designed to mimic the behaviors and have human behavioral learning capabilities of a human being. So ostensibly, when this is fully developed and commercialized, a hashgacha could place this robot in a facility, train it what to look for, train it what to report, while having a built-in camera, and it can mimic human behavior. So if you push it, you could ostensibly push back, call the police, and do whatever a human can do. So once this is actually a reality, what would the Rav say in regards to creating mirsas, possibly even replacing a mashgiach who may have certain limitations?
Who knows, maybe a time will come when a robot will be standing up here and answering your questions. So recently I visited Mobileye here in Yerushalayim, and I was driven from their building in Har Chotzvim to Telstone by an autonomous car. And the driver didn't even touch anything. So I am a bit familiar with these new developments. We need to be very careful not to deviate from the concept of mirrors as described by Chazal. So if those robots or those will act like human beings, but we will have the ability and the obligation to see what they see and to totally control what they do, maybe we would use them once again to enhance. But I think we still have some time to deal with this question before we give a definitive psak. I hope so.
Rabbi Goodnick, Australia. In relation to hindquarter, there are a number of so-called Mahadrin restaurants in Yerushalayim that serve hindquarter, and the mashgiach officially knows which is which, the cuts that you buy. Would hindquarter asa kalim?
So the most important source about Aser and Kalim is the Ramah about the minhag of Bnei Reinus. And Bnei Reinus had a kula, which wasn't accepted by any other kehillah. And the Ramah writes, if you are a host in their house, you don't need to be makbid on Kalim. So that is the only source, and we find there's more leniency regarding Aser and Kalim than actually eating the meat. And based on what we said before, hindquarters is not really usar lefi halacha, it is more of a minhag. And even the minhag it's not a minhag that goes back 1,000 years like kidneyas And as we explained, even 100 or 150 years ago, this was not accepted even by all Ashkenazi Kehelis. So I don't think it would asa the Kalim. But I am surprised to know that there are restaurants in Yerushalayim that have actually that do serve hindquarters, which I wasn't aware of.
Yaakov Teichman, OK Kosher. The Rav said about surveillance cameras that many supermarkets, they utilize surveillance cameras and therefore we know that it works. I'm personally involved with some major supermarkets in the United States, and they have surveillance cameras over every inch of the store. The way that they effectively watch shoplifters is there's a security team that once a week a guy comes for an hour and he watches the entire week of video, and he's very good at jumping for the video. I've watched him, and every single week he catches shoplifters, every single week. I don't think there's any merit to this, even though every sign, every time you walk into every department store, every grocery store, every bank, it says you are being recorded. It has not stopped anybody. It has helped the stores over the past 20 years that they've catch the shoplifters and then they're not allowed to walk back into the store. But the fact of the matter is that the Hamoin Am is still doing the same Geneva and Gzela that they always did.
The fact that they catch shoplifters every week is not conclusive at all, because you don't have the numbers how many people walked in and out of that supermarket. So maybe out of 50,000 people, every week they catch 2 or 3 shoplifters, and you do not know how many shoplifters they didn't catch before the surveillance cameras were in place. So to say, because they catch shoplifters, that proves that surveillance cameras are not mirtas is not correct. So, I cannot argue about information, but what I have read is that shoplifting has gone down by 90% or more, and the only way to verify that is to check your stock. How much is registered, how much was purchased, and how much is missing. The fact that shoplifters are caught proves nothing. It only proves that there still are shoplifters. And the motivation to steal from a supermarket and the chashash to be being caught is not the same as a worker in a plant that would be fired. And therefore, there probably will be more people still stealing, because what do they have to lose? They're going home. Will they come after them because they stole something that cost $15? And will the company invest in going to the police and opening a tick? So what I know is that stealth has gone down dramatically by surveillance cameras, far more than it would be possible before those cameras were put into place.
I think one of the points...
But what I understand from Kol Hamon, from what I'm hearing here, is that the organizations prefer to have mashgichim on the spot, plus cameras, and that definitely is what I would like to see. I never recommended having cameras instead of mashgichim.
I think, just to echo the point that was made until now, I think a lot of times we see the cameras, it's more like Meir Shemayim. It's there, but you don't see it in front of you. Even if the little camera's in the corner, they don't see the person watching them. So it becomes like Meir Shemayim. We all know HaKadosh Baruch Hu exists, but what does knowing mean? It's not in your face. It's not like Meir Rabbah. There's that would be the point I would make.
I think we exhausted this topic.
Cheskel Greenberg, Minnesota, Minneapolis. The Rav mentioned that in the upcoming Shuva, the Rav takes issue with relying on the government for mercies, because many people sitting in jails and didn't have the mercies. Would the Rav extend that to other cases where Moshe used this idea? For example, I believe if a person writes on a document that is like adoption exam, that Jewish, so Moshe would use that, the official document that is perjury, if you write.
But the concept of an official document is not a Moshe. That goes back hundreds of years, what the poskim call the the erki. Erki is based on erkois. Do we rely on governments or official organizations? And what is the degree of their namonos? You know, Rav Moshe is makel to a degree, but this is a discussion which goes many years, and it is not about mirtas. It's not about mirtas. It is about the reliability of officialdom, of government agencies and organizations, where they have a different level of nemonos. I do not think it is associated with mirtas. But Rav Moshe generally, Rav Moshe's tshuva about government, I don't know whether we have the time to go into lumdis, but Rav Moshe writes that yediyah equals riyah. What we know is as if we see, and therefore Rav Moshe argues, if we rely on the law, it is as if we see. But this is such a huge stretch. All we have is umdana. So Rav Moshe quotes the Gemara in Shavuos Lamed Aled, Noshuch begaboy. What is the case there? Two people walked into a room, and one starts screaming. We rush into the room, and he has tooth marks on his back. And we are mechayev the person that does not have tooth marks on his back. Because scientifically, there is no way in the world that a person could bite his own back. That is yediyah. Tosfos argues that level of umdana would be valid even by dinan nefoshes, by Mises Bezdin. So could you compare violation of the law to noshuch begabay? Noshuch begabay is yediyah, unquestionable. There is no other way. If two people were in a room and only one has tooth marks on his back and it's a fresh wound, so Rav Moshe's argument that this is yediyah, to say it is yediyah, we know that no one will violate the law, this is so far-fetched. And I think relying on official documents is another sugya. It's not mirtas. We just have a few more minutes.
Menachem Fishbein, Chavke. I had a different question on a different topic. I wanted to know that nowadays it's very prevalent that people make pizzas into meat pizza. So with that in mind, would it be a problem to make a pizza dough with milchig inside the pizza with the Isser Passion Chalav?
People make pizza, fleischige pizza? But is the dough fleischig?
The dough is usually parev. So what I'm saying, in the past, if someone would make a milchig dough, I think we could assume would only be used for something which is going to be milchigs. But nowadays, that the minute that people have started making meat pizzas, should the Isser apply now to such doughs?
The dough is the same dough. It looks the same. It's the same type of dough. But my minhag is, a question I haven't dealt with, I would never respond spontaneously in a definitive manner. It is a shaila, if you will present it to me in writing, I might respond. I could respond. So thank you. It's a big schus to be here. And my bracha to all of you is Shaloi Teitzei Michshal Metachas Yodeinu. Is Rabbi Ginak around, or he left?
Ginak's right here.
Rabbi Ginak, I understand you're retiring. I'm also considering a retirement, and I could very much identify. And I just want to thank you for your decades of unbelievable service to Klal Yisrael and to Kashrus worldwide. and I hope you're going to have more time to write, and I'm looking forward to Ginot Shoshanim, many more. Yasher Koyach.